Chapter 10. Alone on the Ice. Mawson carried Mertz's body out of the tent and piled blocks of snow around it before reading the burial service. He cut the sled in half and made a sail of Mertz's jacket and a spare clothes bag. Mawson's health was in a dire situation by this point as well. He recorded in his diary, quote, "My whole body is apparently rotting from want of proper nourishment. Frostbitten fingertips festering, mucous membrane of nose gone, saliva glands of mouth refusing duty, skin coming off whole body." To make matters worse, it was at this time that he discovered the soles of his feet had detached, and he had to bind them up every morning to keep the soles in place. When bad weather kept him in his tent, he would mend clothes and tend to his feet and the boils on his face and body. Mawson wrote in his diary of his determination to get back to the hut, due in part to the responsibility he felt to the expedition, and to Paquita. He had extolled his own virtues to her father to convince him to allow her to marry him by talking of the fact that he had never failed at anything, and he was desperate to keep his word. On the 17th of January, as Mawson slogged up yet another rise, he fell 3 meters down into a crevasse. He pulled himself, painfully and slowly, up the rope connecting him to the sled, only to fall back in when he had made it to the top. As he dangled again at the end of the rope, his first thought was of the uneaten food remaining in the sled just a few meters away. Later he wrote of his thoughts as he dangled at the end of the rope, quote, "It would have been but the work of a moment to slip from the harness, then all the pain and the toil would be over. It was a rare situation, a rare temptation, a chance to quit small things for great, to pass from the petty exploration of a planet to the contemplation of vaster worlds beyond. But there was all eternity for the last, and at its longest, the present would be but short." So after 4.5 hours, he made it out of the crevasse and back to the sled. Each day Mawson would creep ever closer to the safety of the hut, but as January wore on, he became increasingly concerned that Captain Davis and the Aurora would have left already to escape the coming winter. But even as he got closer, his health continued to fade. By the end of January, he'd been away from the hut for over 80 days, and his weight had halved from 95 kilograms to just 50. For a man of 6'3", Mawson was practically skeletal. As his health and strength failed, he had to make increasingly difficult decisions about what equipment to keep and what to ditch. One of the items he left behind was his crampons, a decision that would come back to haunt him. Chapter 11. Out of Time. Back in the hut, the group still waited. To begin with, no one in the hut was particularly worried, as they all knew, many of them from personal experience, that delays could occur for a large number of reasons. They all kept themselves busy preparing photographs and specimens and looking forward to leaving. As the days passed without any sign of Mawson's group, they decided to send out a relief party to put out extra depots with food and directions. The party was made up of Hodgman, McLean and Hurley. Their journey was fraught with its own dangers. The snow underfoot was slippery and thin, so they often fell through into crevasses below. When they arrived at a point around 40 kilometres out, they piled up a can of food along with instructions of how to get back to the hut. They stared out into the distance, trying to see any sign of the missing sledging party. Seeing nothing, they turned and made their way back to the hut. Mawson had left instructions that if anything happened to him, Captain Davis was in charge. A week after Mawson was due back, Davis called Bage and Madigan into conference. It was decided that a small group of men would stay in the hut for a second winter, and where possible, search for the missing trio. Deciding who would stay was a serious matter. The prospect of another winter was not a pleasant one. They had all got their hopes up about heading home soon, plus they wouldn't have a summer of exploration to look forward to at the end. But it was Davis's decision on who was to stay. The group to remain was to be led by Madigan and included Page, Bickerton, Hodgman and McLean. Joining the group was Jeffries, the Aurora's wireless operator, who volunteered to stay and take charge of the hut's radio. From a practical perspective, these were all sensible choices. Madigan and Page had been Mawson's choices to lead the other sledging parties, so their experience and skills would have been second to none. McLean, as the medical officer, would have been necessary to provide medical attention if and when the missing explorers were found. Hodgman was an excellent all-rounder and able to help with equipment repairs and other tasks as required. A wireless operator would also be vital to help the hut try to stay in more regular contact with Macquarie Island and Australia throughout the coming winter. Bickerton would have perhaps volunteered to stay, as he was good friends with Ninnis and Mertz and was keen to see their safe return. He was also a man eager to do his duty, whatever that might be. However, he did not relish the prospect of staying, writing, quote, "The thought of another winter is deadening." Madigan would have also accepted it was his duty to stay, but he expressed concerns about whether his Rhodes Scholarship could be extended further. Stores were brought to the hut with the help of the ship's crew, and work was done improving the radio mast and strengthening it against the wind. At the end of January, Davis wrote in his diary, quote, "Mawson is now 16 days overdue. God help a man adrift in this accursed country." January became February, and the weather began to worsen. It was becoming increasingly difficult for Davis and his crew to keep the Aurora safe, and were kept from coming ashore at one point for a week due to the high winds. When it did make it back to shore, the ship was sheathed in ice and the crew were exhausted. Not long after, the port anchor and chain were ripped from their moorings, with the spare anchor lost just 2 days later. The Aurora was now at serious risk of being dashed against the ice, so it had to be constantly on the move, which caused the coal reserves to quickly dwindle. The men in the hut could only watch helpless from shore, and their spirits fell. Lazaron wrote, quote, "For the last week, every night was to have been the last, but are still here. The same old bunks are occupied by the same old chaps. That is, nearly all, but there are 3 vacant. The poor old chief, we loved him with all his faults. Ninnis, Cherub we called him, and X, whose Swiss heart was one of gold, are up on the plateau somewhere." Back out on the ice, Mawson was regretting his decision to ditch his crampons. The snow underfoot was becoming icier the further he went, and he was at risk of serious injury. He had tried to fashion some new crampons by attaching nails and screws to the bottom of some spare pieces of wood, but these were ineffective and broke after just a few hours. However, he had been buoyed by the sight of some familiar landmarks, and had been steering himself roughly in the direction that he thought Aladdin's cave was. As he slipped and stumbled along, dragging the battered and worn sled behind, he saw a stack of stones at the top of a rise. On approach, he saw that it was a cairn, and at the bottom was a crate. He tore open the crate with numb fingers, and nearly wept upon seeing its contents. There was a red Paquita bag inside with tins of food, and a fresh orange. The presence of fresh fruit told Mawson that the Aurora had arrived back in Antarctica. Alongside the food was a note. The note provided instructions for how to get to Aladdin's cave, which was just 40 kilometres away, as well as confirmation that Captain Davis and the Aurora had arrived, and that all of the other sledging parties had made it back to the hut safely, and they were waiting for Mawson's team before departing. Mawson scanned the page to see when it was sent. If it was many days previously, then perhaps the rescue ship had already departed. With shock, Mawson saw that the letter had been left by the group of Hurley, McLean and Hodgman just 6 hours previously. He would have simultaneously cursed his bad luck at missing the others by such a short period of time, and cursing his decision to ditch his crampons, which would have almost certainly cost him at least that amount of time. However, he would have also been encouraged by the fact that it meant the Aurora was still in the harbour, and still waiting. The question was, but for how long? After eating his fill, he pushed on towards Aladdin's cave. Upon entering it, his relief would have been immediate and immense. The cave too had been restocked with food, both fresh and tinned. Mawson had hoped that there might be some crampons in amongst the supplies, but in this respect, like so many other respects, he had no luck. Even though that he would have known that time was of the essence, Mawson did not rush to make it back to the hut. For starters, the weather was not favourable, and he did not feel he could take the risk even on such a relatively short journey. In addition, he knew that the slope down to the hut from the cave would be extremely icy, and to attempt that journey without any crampons at all would likely end in serious injury or worse. So he took the time to repair his clothes and equipment, including crafting some better makeshift crampons out of bits of crate. However, the location of the Aurora weighed on him constantly. In his diary, he wrote simply, "Will the ship wait?" On the 7th of February, while Mawson was at Aladdin's cave, Captain Davis decided that they could wait no longer. He was sure that the men at the hut had sufficient supplies to keep them going for a second winter. However, the men with Frank Wild in the western base had no such provisions, and they had to be the priority now. So Captain Davis and everyone except the 6 men staying in the hut rowed back out to the waiting Aurora. The farewells were quick and subdued. The following morning, Mawson left the relative luxury of the cave and set off towards the hut. As he trudged slowly towards it, he saw a figure outside and called out. The man turned and stared before rushing up the slope towards him. It was Bickerton. Mawson was half carried into the hut where Madigan and the others gathered around excitedly. Their joy at seeing Mawson again quickly faded as they learned the fate of both Ninnis and Mertz. The 2 men had been extremely popular amongst all of the other expedition members, and they all keenly felt their loss. Jeffries, the new radio operator, made a call to the Aurora to give them the news. The message said, quote, "Mawson arrived, Mertz and Ninnis dead. Return at once and pick up all hands." As ordered, the Aurora turned back to pick them up, but again the weather prevented them from landing. Again, Captain Davis was faced with the same terrible decision, and again he decided he had to go to the western base as they could not survive another winter. The journey west was a difficult one. The ship had to navigate along narrow paths through a field of icebergs. The mists were near constant, which reduced their visibility to the point where they constantly scraped along the sides of the giant icebergs. Eventually, one of the lookouts spotted a group of 7 figures standing down by the shore. However, the group that had been left had numbered 8, so Davis and the others feared the worst. But it wasn't until they sailed closer that they realised the figures were not Antarctic explorers, but were penguins. Not long after, they saw a flag flying at the top of the wireless mast, and soon the hut rolled into view. As they sailed closer, they saw men on the bay ice. Wild and his team were all alive and well, and the 8 men and their last 2 remaining sled dogs quickly came aboard. They had been anxiously awaiting the arrival of the Aurora and had most of their equipment and specimens already packed and ready. The Western Base party had their own set of adventures, moments of peril, moments of discovery that the main party had, but without the tragic loss of life. Their expedition had almost not even got started, however, as when they had first sailed west, they had failed to find any suitable landing spots in the proposed area. This had meant they were forced to travel far further west than anticipated, which meant that the coal reserves began to be a concern. In the end, Wild had opted for a site which was not on the Antarctic landmass, but was on an ice shelf jutting out into the sea. Davis, always a cautious man, had tried to dissuade him of this course of action, noting the dangers if the ice shelf broke away. Wild was not to be deterred, however, possibly because it was the best of any available options, and the 8 men in his team had disembarked and quickly assembled their hut. Seeing the Aurora come back the following year would have been of enormous relief to Wild and his team, because they knew that if something had happened to the Aurora after it dropped them off, then no one would have known where they had landed, and rescue would have been all but impossible. Now that they were safely on board the Aurora again, Wild spoke of the snow that had buried their hut almost completely during the winter. Whereas Mawson's group had still been able to scramble in and out using normal entrances to the hut, Wild and his team had had to dig up and out of the snow and enter and exit the building by climbing ladders. During the summer, they had undertaken various scientific activities and had set out on sledging parties to survey the surrounding area. The weather during this time was so bad that they were only able to travel on 12 out of 25 days, including a period of 7 consecutive days when they were not able to leave their tents. On the 15th of March, 1912, the Aurora arrived in Hobart, Australia. The men of the Australasian Antarctic expedition on board had been away for 16 months. Most of the men went their separate ways, not knowing if they would see any of the others again. The 2 dogs of the western base, Zip and Amundsen, were put into quarantine, but Amundsen died during a heatwave. Zip was able to come out of quarantine and lived with the western base member Harrison and his family for a time before being moved to a wildlife park. There he spent the rest of his days hauling delighted visitors around on a sledge. But amid the greetings, the celebrations, and the farewells, there were thoughts of men left behind. There would be no possibility of sending a rescue team until the start of the following summer. Chapter 12. The Second Winter. The men who stayed for the second winter with Mawson had been in a state of shock to begin with. Firstly, at the loss of Ninnis and Mertz, which affected Bickerton and Madigan, the other 2 members of the affectionately titled Hyde Park Corner, most strongly. Madigan woke one night to hear Bickerton sobbing under his blankets. The group were also shocked at Mawson's physical condition. After his return, and for weeks afterwards, all he could do was eat, sleep, and try to recover. Mawson encouraged the others to stay as busy as they could and reintroduced as many daily routines as possible. As Mawson's health improved, he began to wonder about the Aurora and having missed the boat ride home. He wasn't sure whether his body would have survived the grueling journey back to Australia, and whether, in fact, staying in the hut for a second winter wouldn't end up saving his life. He also spent a lot of time thinking of Paquita. When Davis had arrived to pick everyone up, he had delivered 4 letters from Paquita to Mawson. He read and reread those letters often, as well as staring at the photo of her that she had included. In one of her letters to him, Paquita wrote of the torment of the long periods of not hearing anything. She called it, quote, the everlasting silence, and that she had begun to wonder whether he did still love her, and whether he would break off their engagement when he got back. She wrote to him, quote, "Are you frozen? Am I pouring out a little of what is in my heart to an iceberg?" Mawson reflected on the letters that he had sent to her, having been carried back to Australia on the Aurora when it first dropped him in Antarctica. His letters were short and functional. In one he wrote, quote, "The general reports of the expedition are in the newspapers and I need not repeat." Mawson was only now realising how important it was for her to hear his voice through his letters, and not just the other way round. While he waited out the winter, he wrote more letters to her, even though he knew that he would be delivering them to her in person. He wrote reassurances of his love and his commitment to their marriage, saying, quote, "Had I been really incapacitated to be your husband, I should not have reached the hut." One of the main differences in the hut from the previous winter was the success of the wireless radio. Thanks to the efforts of improving the mast, communications in both directions were established. Through the radio, Mawson was able to send messages back about the deaths of Ninnis and Mertz, including messages of condolence to their families. and this news made it back well before the Aurora did. While the team waited in the hut, news came over the wireless of the successful expedition of Amundsen to be the first person to the South Pole. The more tragic news of the deaths of Captain Robert Scott and his team members on their way back from the South Pole affected Mawson deeply. He had met Captain Scott on several occasions, and remembering their first visit, could not help but think of how it could have been him that died alongside Scott if he had agreed to Scott's proposal all those years ago. Using the wireless for personal messages was limited, but Mawson was eager to contact Paquita. Even though his health was improving, he knew he was more physically frail than he'd had been, and didn't want Paquita to feel beholden to marry a man who was so changed. He got Jeffries to send through a message to her saying, quote, "Deeply regret delay. Effects now gone, but lost my hair. You are free to consider your contract." He was much relieved to get her speedy response, quote, "Deeply thankful you are safe. Warmest welcome awaiting your hairless return. Regarding contract, same as ever, only more so." Madigan also used the wireless for personal reasons. He was able to get an extended deferral for the start of his Rhodes Scholarship. The successful operation of the wireless would not have been possible without the men at Macquarie Island also agreeing to spend a second winter as part of the expedition. However, relationships on the island were fraught, and the main wireless operator, Sawyer, left the island on a supply boat in August. Back at the hut, the men tried their best to keep occupied with scientific experiments and readings, but most of the work had been done the previous winter. One of the most successful scientific experiments was conducted by Mawson himself. He, like most of the men in the hut, had grown extremely weary of the same food week after week. So Mawson successfully cultivated yeast, and the first thing he made was a batch of muffins. McLean kept himself occupied by being editor of the base's paper, the Adelie Blizzard. There had been a long tradition of Antarctic expedition bases producing their own papers, but it hadn't happened in the first winter due to the extensive amount of scientific work required, as well as the preparations for the sledging parties. 5 issues of the publication were produced, totalling over 200 pages, all edited and typed by McLean. The publication included letters to the editor, book reviews, short stories, as well as drawings by Bickerton and Hodgman. No topic was off limits, except for the wind. The new radio operator, Jeffries, was put in a difficult position to begin with. He was a new man amongst a group of men who had lived together for more than a year. However, his diligence and skill with the wireless earned him the respect of the others in the hut. But as winter dragged on, the others observed a change in his behaviour and demeanour. They could hear him muttering and whispering to himself at night, and he frequently burst into laughter for no apparent reason. The first sign that something was seriously wrong occurred in early July. Over dinner, Madigan had mentioned the book The Hound of the Baskervilles, as both he and Bickerton were currently reading it. Jeffries took this to be a slur aimed at him, and demanded that Madigan go with him to the next room to fight. Madigan had taken offence to this in turn, but tempers were calmed when Mawson stepped in. The following morning, the altercation did become physical, when Jeffries punched Madigan in the face, and the two had to be hauled apart by Hodgman and Mawson. Jeffries became increasingly paranoid and erratic. He stopped washing himself or his clothes, and began collecting his urine in jars which he stored on the shelf above his bed. He asked Bickerton to be his backup if things turned to shooting. This alarmed everyone, and they began locking up the firearms. As the medical officer, Mawson asked McLean for help, but as the field of mental health was just in its infancy, McLean had little to offer in the way of treatment or support. He did confide in Mawson that, quote, "Jeffries has shown undoubted signs of delusive insanity." Mawson ordered that Jeffries was to be watched around the clock. Jeffries started to refuse to operate the wireless except when he felt like it, which prompted Mawson to ask Bickerton, to get better at sending and receiving messages, as he feared being cut off. The need for others to learn the wireless became crucial when Jeffries admitted to Mawson that he had sent a message saying the others in the hut were insane and were trying to kill him. Mawson banned Jeffries from using the wireless, but got Bickerton to send a message saying that any further messages from Jeffries were to be ignored, just in case. The final few weeks of winter were extremely tense, with all of the men having to be very careful around Jeffries, and thankfully there were no further incidents. Trying to look after a mentally ill man took its toll on Mawson, and his own health recovered slowly. Finally, word came through over the wireless that the Aurora was fitted out and was heading south to get them. Mawson organised some small-scale sledging expeditions, primarily aimed at retrieving scientific equipment and specimens that the previous year's expeditions had had to abandon on their way back to the hut. On board the Aurora were 3 of the original main base expedition members, Hurley, Carrell, and Hunter. Each had their own reasons for wanting to travel back to Antarctica. Hunter hoped to continue his biological research, including the dredging work that Captain Davis had planned. Carrell was keen to test out his latest gadget fascination, colour photography, and Hurley was eager to get some further photographs of his own to supplement his portfolio. On the 28th of November, 1913, the Aurora arrived at Macquarie Island to pick up the 4 men who had worked on the cold, wet and windswept island for nearly 2 years. 3 other men were left on the island to continue the wireless and meteorological work. On December 13th, the Aurora entered the bay at Cape Denison. On their trek up to the hut, Davis and the others came to a cross that Bickerton had made and had erected with the help of McLean. It was 3 metres tall and read, quote, "To commemorate the supreme sacrifice made by Lieutenant B.E.S. Ninnis and Dr. X. Mertz in the cause of science." As they neared the hut, the door opened, and Mawson himself stepped out. He smiled and said, "Hello, back again," before turning back into the hut to call to the others that the boat had arrived. Everyone was delighted to see each other, none more so than Davis upon seeing Mawson again. He wrote in his diary, quote, "As I shook his hand, I was conscious of a sudden feeling of intense relief. Relief that he was alive and well. Relief that I'd been able to do my duty. My life has given me few moments that have been more rewarding." The men who had wintered in the hut were overjoyed to see their old friends again and were ready to leave. However, the weather had not played its last part in the story, and a great wind blew up. The Aurora was tossed around, its anchor dragging as the ship was pulled out of the relative safety of the harbour. The motorboat was ripped from its mooring and was lost. Captain Davis risked his own life on several occasions to keep the boat and the men aboard safe. Eventually, however, the winds died back and the Aurora was ready to depart. The hut was closed by Madigan and Bickerton on December 23rd, 1913. But the expedition wasn't yet finished. For over a month, the Aurora sailed along the Antarctic coastline as the men on board took further observations of the wildlife and the geography and surveyed the ocean floor. Then, on the 26th of February 1914, the former whaling ship limped into Adelaide Harbour. Mawson, Madigan and the others who had spent 2 winters in Antarctica had been away for nearly 2.5 years. Back on land, the final group of expedition members said their farewells. In his diary, Hurley wrote, quote, "It was with deep regret that we said goodbye to one another. Intimate association and the stern code of the South had bound us with the ties of a brotherhood. When I turn south again, may my comrades be such characters as the men of the Australasian Antarctic expedition." Chapter 13. Aftermath. Mawson had sent word ahead of the ship of their arrival, and his mother and his fiancée Paquita were there waiting for him. The expedition arrived back to much fanfare and excitement. The conquering of the South Pole by Amundsen and the tragic deaths of Scott and his expedition team members had reignited interest in Antarctica, and Mawson's expedition, with its own tales of tragedy, heroism and discovery, quickly sparked the interest of the Australian public. Mawson spent the next few weeks moving from one speaking engagement to another, but it didn't distract him entirely from Paquita, and by the end of March, they were married. In April, they sailed back to London, where Mawson continued with his speaking engagements, and he was knighted in June 1914. Even amongst the meetings and engagements, Mawson pressed on with writing up the expedition and trying to get it published as a book entitled The Home of the Blizzard. Much of the editing and rewriting work was completed by Maclean. Hodgman too was involved, particularly in terms of the maps and illustrations. Some of Frank Hurley's photography was used, as were the colour photographs taken by Carrel on the last leg of the expedition. However, Mawson's plan to publish the book quickly and to capitalise on the public's interest in the expedition and Antarctica evaporated as the First World War engulfed the planet. While in London, Mawson and Paquita visited the parents of Belgrave Ninnis. Paquita wrote that she wasn't sure their visit provided much comfort, but that what possibly helped the family come to terms with his death was the recent fate of the army regiment he had left to join the expedition, the Royal Fusiliers. The regiment had suffered heavy losses in France, and Paquita wrote, quote, "Somehow, death in an icy crevasse seemed more fitting to his youth than slaughter in the mud of Flanders, however sacred the latter became to us all." The two also travelled to Switzerland to spend time with Mertz's family, but again were unable to provide any comfort. Jeffries left Adelaide soon after arriving back in Australia, heading towards Queensland where his sister anxiously waited for him. He never made it to her, however, as he got off the train in Victoria and wandered in the bush for 6 days before reappearing. He was committed to a mental asylum for the rest of his life. Many of the men of the Australasian Antarctic expedition fought in the First World War. Lazaron enlisted in 1914, but was discharged after being shot in the ankle in Egypt. Madigan joined the Royal Engineers. Bickerton was a fighter pilot and shot down 2 German aircraft. Hodgman saw combat in Gallipoli in Macedonia. Maclean was a medic serving near the front lines. However, he was discharged after he was poisoned in a gas attack in France and returned to Australia. He never recovered and died in 1922. Page, who had been an officer in the Royal Australian Engineers before the expedition, was killed during the Gallipoli campaign in 1915. Blake, the cartographer on Macquarie Island, was killed by artillery fire in France in 1918. Many of the men would head back to the Antarctic, but not all of them would return. Charles Harrison, a member of the Western Base Party, visited Macquarie Island in 1914, but his ship disappeared without a trace on its return journey to Australia, with the loss of all 21 men aboard. Frank Wild and Frank Hurley joined Ernest Shackleton on his Imperial Transantarctic expedition of 1914 to 1917. John King Davis, still captain of the Aurora, was also part of the expedition. During their travels, the Aurora got stuck in pack ice and drifted for 6 months before getting free and returning to Australia for repairs. The Aurora's part in that expedition was not over, however, as the ship was called in to rescue Shackleton and some of his men after their ship, the Endurance, had been crushed by sea ice. Frank Wild would also accompany Shackleton as part of the Shackleton-Rowett expedition of 1921 to 1922. During this expedition, Shackleton died suddenly and Wild took over command for the remainder of the expedition. Upon returning home, Wild is quoted as saying, "I think that my work there is done," and he never returned to Antarctica. The Aurora itself had seen the last of Antarctica, but was still seaworthy and was sold to a coal merchant. On the 20th of June 1917, the ship set sail from Newcastle, Australia, bound for Wellington, New Zealand, but was never heard from again. Mawson himself had one last Antarctic expedition in him. In 1929, he led the British, Australian and New Zealand Antarctic expedition. Also joining him were former expedition team members Frank Hurley and Captain Davis, now skipper of the ship the Discovery. This expedition resulted in the formation of the Australian Antarctic Territory in 1936. Outside of this, Mawson spent most of his time in Australia working in the fields of geology and mineralogy. He was a professor at the University of Adelaide from 1921 until his retirement in 1952. On the 13th of October 1952, he suffered a stroke and lost consciousness. This was 50 years to the day since Mawson had first set foot in Antarctica. He died the following day, aged 76. He was survived by Paquita and their 2 daughters. Mawson and other members of the expedition were honoured by having features and landmarks in Antarctica named after them, including Cape Mawson, the Mertz Glacier, and the Ninnis Glacier. Sources for the story include Home of the Blizzard by Douglas Mawson, Mawson of the Antarctic by Paquita Mawson, Argonauts of the South by Frank Hurley, An Antarctic Affair by Emma McEwen, Alone on the Ice by David Roberts, Flaws in the Ice in Search of Douglas Mawson by David Day, Aurora, Douglas Mawson and the Australasian Antarctic Expedition by Bo Riffenberg, and Mawson's Remarkable Men by David Jensen.